We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Media Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island, the naked city, the city of, well, about 360,000 or so stories. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership, coalitionradio.us. We now podcast. We're on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and of course, Spreaker. This is an issue that I'd love to say has caught me by surprise. Certainly the implementation of it has. As I alluded to during my morning appearance on Rhode Island's A Lively Experiment, I happen to believe that there are political machinations underlying the announcement yesterday by Attorney General Barr that they would in fact schedule 5 federal executions after a roughly 16-year hiatus. May or may not have that number right. Ironically, the week before, I reached out to an organization that had appeared on the Coalition during our pre-digital days when we were on AM radio on WPRO AM 630. And I'm talking about, of course, conservatives concerned about the death penalty. Hannah Cox is the national manager of it. She was previously Director of Outreach for the Beacon Center of Tennessee, a free market think tank. Also Director of Development for the Tennessee Firearms Association and a policy advocate for the National Alliance on Mental Illness. She joins us today after, well, let's just say a hectic couple of days. She's appeared on Fox News. I think she's been pretty much everywhere. Because out of the blue, we have this dramatic reversal, if you will, of a federal policy that was, like most federal policies, complicated, nuanced, and not easily explained. So it is with great pride that I introduce to you for the first time Hannah Cox. Welcome to the Coalition.
Thanks so much, Fred. Appreciate you having me on.
All right, so the first question obviously is, you folks are immersed in this. You've got a great website. We'll get into that in just a couple minutes. But did this catch you by surprise as well? Had you gotten any inklings of this taking place?
Well, yeah. I mean, we knew that this was a possibility for some time. I will say we thought it would be a little bit later in the year, so it did come a bit sooner than we anticipated. But we are still really disappointed. I think there was a lot of hope that the federal government would take note of what's been transpiring in the states over the past decade and follow suit. But unfortunately, they're not choosing to do that.
Right. Now, give us a little bit of a history of your organization. Folks who might not be familiar to you, I got a number of surprise reactions from people across social media yesterday and today when we were publicizing your appearance, because the natural association is that social conservatives, who are often conflated with conservatives, would be opposed to the death penalty. So how did you folks come to be, and talk to us about how you became involved?
Yeah, I think for many, many decades in this country, it was true that most people on the left were pro-repealing the death penalty and people on the right were pro-keeping it. We've seen a real shift away from that in the past 2 decades. There's been a lot of just first and foremost education around how the criminal justice system is actually functioning, and that includes the death penalty as well. So we were formed sort of organically in Montana around 2007 or so by ProLife activists and people who were working around the political scene at their capital, who felt really strongly that their pro-life views should be consistent and that should be applied not only to the birth of a child, but all the way through the natural death of a person, and really thought that the pro-life movement was not holding true to that. And so they started advocating under this name, and it really started to take off. I think it first and foremost just gave people a place to kind of belong. I think there were many people on the right who had been questioning the death penalty for some time, or who had already turned against it and just were kind of being quiet about it because they didn't want to be ostracized and thought they were the only ones. So when the organization came on the scene, it really let people know, like, they're not the only ones. There's a lot of people that are having these same thought processes. And then for other people who maybe had not hit that point yet, it made them really start questioning, okay, I'm a conservative. Well, why should I not support the death penalty? What am I missing here? And so as it grew, it started to get national attention, and a lot of other states were wanting to develop their own chapters. And so we actually went national as an organization in 2013 and have been growing since that point. So we work across the country in various states And we just simply try to educate people, both within social conservative and mainstream conservative and even libertarian circles, about why the reasons we don't think the death penalty aligns with our values of a limited government, fiscal responsibility, and protecting the sanctity of human life.
What's fascinating to me is the connection with folks who are pro-life. Has there ever been any sort of formal study done in terms of polling at any level on attitudes of the pro-life movement towards the death penalty?
Not that I'm aware of off the top of my head, but I will say that we do tend to find a good bit of support from within that community for our work, and that certainly continues to grow.
Is it true amongst evangelicals as well, or?
Yeah, I think, traditionally no, but I also think you're seeing a real awakening continue to spread within that community too. We have many evangelicals in our midst. I think that, I myself am an evangelical, and I used to support the death penalty, but it was before I had really done a lot of research into it or spent very much time actually contemplating it. And once I really started to do my due diligence in that area, I think it was some of the factors around how the death penalty operates that first got my attention and caused me to change my stance, including the innocence issues and the cost and the arbitrariness. But once that occurred, I really became convinced that if I believe what I said I believed, which as a Christian I believe that people can be redeemed at any point and their lives can still be changed and used for good, then I don't think we should in any way be cutting short the time that God has to work in somebody's life. And I think that it's a real hypocritical stance to say that just because someone has committed harm, that their life is now disposable.
Right. And as a libertarian, I'm often astonished by folks who preach the mantra of small government and limited government, yet at the same time would hand to government, if you will, the ultimate right, the ultimate power, which is the power over life and death, which is arbitrarily decided by folks who are ultimately imperfect, and that's all human beings. None of us have that level of perfection that we should have that power. So to be frustrated with a government over, shall we say, the Second Amendment, rightly so, or perhaps the infringement on the Fourth Amendment, yet at the same time willingly allow a government to execute is frankly bizarre to me. I've just never been able to make that connection. Now, you folks have a wonderful website. It's conservativesconcerned.org. That's simple. And let's explore some of the reasons why that you mentioned in brief in sort of a summary form. And I'm specifically going to the why we're concerned section, because the beauty of this website is it lays out in an extremely logical manner exactly why conservatives should not embrace this sort of, I believe, bizarre extension of a criminal law, law and order ethos, and that in fact one needs to look beyond the curtain. In your first point, you talk about the risk of execution an innocent person. Organizations like the Innocence Project, for example, in the era of DNA, if you will, have come to astounding conclusions based not on urban myth, legends, or feelings, but on fact. Talk to us about why you're concerned about innocent executions.
Yeah, well, I think that was the first thing that really got my attention, and it gets the attention of many people. Our system is simply overrun with wrongful convictions, and it's really pretty astounding considering the amount of numbers we've seen of people exonerated from our system, that we still have the audacity to think we should be carrying out matters of life and death. So for the statistics are, one person has been exonerated from death row for every 10 executions in this country since reinstatement of the death penalty. On top of that, you have many other people who've been released from death row for other innocence issues, maybe took Alford pleas or had their trials reversed or weren't fully exonerated, but there were innocence issues in their trials as well. And then you have about 800 plus people who've been exonerated who were charged and found guilty of homicide but simply weren't given the death penalty. So, I mean, you've got over 1,000 people as a whole who've been in some way charged for homicide and sentenced and proven innocent. And I just think that's really, really outrageous and quite terrifying. I think with those numbers, it's almost a given that we have executed innocent people, and I know that we will continue to do so as long as we have the system.
Right. Should tragedy ever dictate public policy?
I'm sorry, should what?
Tragedies in the forms of,
Oh,
should it ever
yeah.
dictate public policy, in your opinion?
I think that at the end of the day, we should learn from tragedies. We should certainly have public policy responses to public tragedies. But I think that the reality is they don't need to be steered by emotional arguments. And I think that so often when we get into matters of public safety and crime and violence, you do find a lot of emotional arguments on these issues versus fact and evidence-based arguments.
Okay. No, I'm with you 100%. And it would seem that, particularly in an era, hopefully at the end of the war on drugs, that you've got an exponential increase in DNA refutation, if you will, of criminal cases. Is the organization that you're involved with, are you close to any of these innocence projects, or have you worked in tandem with them, or what are your thoughts? What are the more effective ones that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, we're huge fans of them. We're kind of working on different issues, though. They're mostly working on the actual cases and in the litigation realm, whereas we're policy focused, so there's not a ton of overlap there, but obviously hold them with tremendous respect.
The second stage is you talk about a complicated process that's drained our resources. Now we're getting to the heart of a true conservative, right? Speak to the enormous waste of resources, whether it be time, money. Speak to that, if you will. That can't be underemphasized.
Yeah, so the death penalty is the most expensive part of the criminal justice system on a per offender basis. I don't think that surprises anyone. I think most people know that the death penalty is really expensive, but they erroneously think that it's because it takes too long and that if you were to simply speed up the process, that would solve it. Nothing could be further from the truth. The reality is that the death penalty costs about $750,000 to $1 million more per case than the next most expensive punishment, which is life in prison without parole. And when you consider that most people who receive a death sentence still end up serving life without parole because the leading cause of death on death row are natural causes, you have to sit back and say, okay, why is the death penalty so much more expensive than life without parole? Well, the reason is the trial. 70% of the costs are incurred at the trial level alone, meaning even if the jury doesn't give the death sentence, even if an execution never occurs, the state is already spending that much more money in excess to just even consider a death penalty case than it would for life in prison without parole. Where studies have been done, we've seen that states spend on average about $11 million a year in excess on the death penalty. And so it's really, really wasteful. That's a lot of money on top of what you could be doing, which, at the end of the day, you got to ask, if we're mostly having people serve life in prison without parole anyways, why are we spending all of this money to basically go through the show of having a death penalty trial? But furthermore, that's a huge opportunity cost because that's money that we're not spending on programs that actually could work to deter crime, which we know the death penalty does not. And that's money that we're not spending to solve more crimes. The nation's really, really bad at solving crimes. We have only a 51% average national clearance rate in this country. That means almost half of our homicides are going totally unsolved. When you're spending millions of dollars in excess on the death penalty and getting nothing in return and letting the majority or almost majority of homicides go unsolved, that's not a tough on crime system, and it's certainly not producing justice for all.
The organization speaks very eloquently. In fact, you may be one of the few organizations that speaks eloquently towards the needs of the victim's family. How is the death penalty system failed the victim's family?
Yeah, I think this particular talking point really kind of gets emotional and difficult because I think so often I see victims used as a pawn in this discussion, and it's really infuriating. And I often feel that people who are proponents of the death penalty throw out victims without ever having actually sat down and talked to victims' family members. And I would encourage people to do that because, not all victims feel the same. I would never attempt to speak for all victims, and there's a lot of nuance to how victims feel. But what I can tell you is that there is a very large contingent of murder victims' family members who are adamantly opposed to the death penalty and who are very vocal about how the system has perpetrated more harm, has prevented them from having closure, and is not serving the needs of victims. And I feel like they're often overlooked. You see the victims elevated by the media or by prosecutors or law enforcement or proponents of it, but they're only talking to the ones who are saying what they want to hear. They're not, totally ignoring the other half of the victims. And that was really stark in New Hampshire this year, where we passed death penalty repeal. So it's fresh in my memory. And I was there for a lot of the committee hearings, and you would see dozens upon dozens upon dozens. I can't even tell you how many murder victims' family members showed up to testify in support of repealing the death penalty and told their personal stories about how this system had harmed them and how they didn't want it done in their name. And then you had one, I repeat, one victim's family member who showed up in support of keeping it, and that was who all the attention went to. And I thought that was really disrespectful.
Right, because let's talk about just the process of jurisprudence, if you will. What kind of statistics have you seen about how a death penalty phase in terms of lengthening the time of trial? Because ultimately, and pleased, and this is why I'm so grateful that you've come on, there's so much misinformation, there's so many urban legends associated with this. My understanding is that in most cases, you've got the criminal phase where the individual is adjudicated as either being guilty or non-guilty. Then you enter the penalty phase. And the penalty phase for a death penalty, what does that phase typically incorporate, and how often can it last?
Yeah, so that's correct. Death penalty cases do take place over two parts. You have the trial phase, which is determining guilt and innocence, and then you have the sentencing phase. Those trials do typically take a much longer time period than your average trial, which is, again, why the trial is so expensive. You have more hours worked by all involved. And then if a death sentence is handed down, it, of course, moves into a pretty lengthy appellate process, which is constitutionally guaranteed, and that I think we obviously need, and maybe even need a more stringent process because we have so many cases of wrongful convictions. But all of that equals the victim's family members having to be drugged through the court system for, years and years, sometimes decades. And they're promised along this pathway by members of law enforcement and prosecutors that they're going to get closure from this. This is something that's going to, even out the score in some way. And what so many of them find is that ongoing system really keeps them from having any kind of finality or closure and from being able to start to rebuild their lives. They're instead kind of stuck in this perpetual situation where they're having to go in and out of court and constantly be reconfronted with the defendant. And I think it's really traumatizing for a lot of people. And oftentimes they either are opposed to it from the very beginning because they already aren't supportive of the death penalty from an ethical standpoint. And other times they become opposed to it after going through this. And then even others, stay proponents all the way up until the execution date and then feel really misled and lied to because they don't get that closure that they were looking for. So there's a lot of different perspectives that I've heard from victims' family members about what the system's like for them. But almost across the board, I've heard from people who have been through this for many years say, if it had just been a final sentence like life without parole, I could have begun rebuilding my life years ago. I could have started processing and moved through that phase, and it would have been a better outcome. And so I think that we should pay attention to that.
Right, because we even look at the national political elections right now. You've got a Democratic candidate who, until very recently, until she sensed that maybe she wasn't being received with the fervor that she thought, was touting effectively her prosecution rate. And of course, I'm talking about Kamala Harris, who is no friend, if you will, to her law and order attitudes and the type of caseload she's taken on. Were no friend to the libertarian movement whatsoever. You've got this, political points being made literally on the backs of victims, and it's reprehensible. And God forbid that the victim or members of the victim families were either part of the criminal case itself, in the sense that they were either witnesses or parts of the evidentiary phase of the trial, because, again, I'm not an expert, I would imagine that would have to be relived throughout the entire appellate process. So you're literally sentencing the victims' families to their own special prison sentence. And I apologize if that sounds cliched or hackneyed, but that's quite frankly the case. Their lives.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Then people don't usually bring that up, but the reality is that most people who are killed by someone they know. So the likelihood that you're dealing with a family on both sides of the case is pretty high, and so that's a real reality that people face. And I think that's obviously quite traumatic. But even when it's not, an interfamily crime, you still have to think about all the other family members that are impacted by this. Even when someone has committed harm, what that does to their family if they have a person who is executed, what that does to a child if their parent is executed. And what we end up seeing is that the death penalty really just perpetuates these cycles of violence and trauma, and it's not in any way productive or producing better outcomes.
Right. Because the next step that's so cleanly laid out on conservativesconcerned.org, why we're concerned page, is that the reality, again, not the myth, not the fake news, but the reality is that in no way does the death penalty keep us safe, does it?
No, we see from all of the data that we've evaluated nationwide that there's no evidence the death penalty is a deterrent whatsoever. And in fact, usage of the death penalty tends to correlate with higher rates of violent crime, whereas regions that get rid of it or who don't use it as frequently tend to see lower rates of violent crime and see continued decrease in those crime rates. So I think that quite the opposite could be argued, and I would go back to those costs as the factor there. When you're spending millions of dollars in excess on the death penalty, that's money you're not spending on programs that actually do work, and it's money you're not spending to solve more crime. So it makes sense that you continue to have higher violent crime rates around the death penalty.
Right. And I believe one of the most stunning, if you will, indictments, for lack of a better term, of the criminal justice system, and particularly as it applies to death penalty candidates, prisoners, is the notion of how grotesquely incompetent our judicial system can be to people of lesser means, and the imbalance that occurs between executions based on, demographics as opposed to either the heinous nature of the crime or the, if you will, the ability to convict. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well, we know that the leading causes or determinants in sentencing for a death penalty have really very little to do with the nature of the crime. The first leading cause is the location where the crime is committed. Mm-hmm. So we see that only about 2% of counties are bringing the majority of death penalty cases in this country. And to date, since reinstatement, all executions have come from less than 16% of counties. So it's very random. You could literally look at the death row population in a state and see a crime that was committed in one county gets a death penalty, and a nearly identical crime that was committed in another county get maybe not even life. It's so random. The next leading determinant in whether or not someone gets a death penalty is means. Can you afford to hire a good attorney? You'd be really hard pressed to find people of economic means on death row. It just doesn't tend to happen. And then the third leading determinant is the race of the victim. If you kill a white person, you are exponentially more likely to get the death penalty than if you kill a black person or a Hispanic person. In California, you're 3 times more likely to get it if you kill a white person. In Louisiana, you're 96% times more likely to get it if you kill a white person. And across the nation, in all cases studied, there's been evidence of bias against the defendant's race or the victim's race of both in 96% of cases. So those are really the leading causes and who gets it. And it has very little to do with the heinousness of the crime, which is what many people are under the impression of in the system.
So the entire system, it would appear, is based on really the capriciousness of your own individual circumstances. It's the decision to execute someone based on a criminal case that may be or may not be highly flawed, that on an evidentiary base may in fact have been manipulated, and then the ability of someone who's going to be executed to fight it is economically based. It sounds like just such a horrifically, tragically flawed system. For the love of God, why would Attorney General Barr and the Trump administration, and clearly the president, look to do this? I mean, in your opinion, and I'm not, I'll let you answer however you want. We've not gotten to know each other yet in terms of the organization's political nature versus your focus on the facts. But is this a political theater that's taking place here? Or was there any consideration other than that involved in that?
You know, I can't at all speak to their mindsets or what their reasoning is. My best guesses are what we typically see, which is that support for the death penalty runs about a mile wide and an inch deep. And I think that support tends to be high until people take just even the slightest amount of time to really look at how it's operating, upon which you see support quickly wane. And I think that's what's led to the ongoing downward trajectory in both the use and popularity of the death penalty in this country as we've moved into the age of information. People are getting to look behind the scenes of the criminal justice system in a way they never have before, and they're really getting to get up close and personal and see how it's functioning, and they're terrified because it is a hot mess, and it's nowhere near the system that we are taught we were founded upon, which is that we were supposed to have a system that favors the defendant, right, that protects the defendant from the government, that is set up so that it would be better that 100 guilty men go free than one innocent person perish. Well, that's great. That's what we're taught. But if you look at it, that's not what's happening. And I think that's why you're seeing a real shift in public opinion. That being said, Trump and Barr are both from an older generation, and I think their policies really age them in this area because they're just way out of the loop.
Because the next and final area, until we get into a little bit more about information about your organization, is, of course, the protocols employed. And I hope I'm using the terminology correctly. What I mean protocol is the actual methodology in which the execution is carried out. Now, this is troubled in a number of areas. You've got nations embargoing and pharmaceutical firms embargoing the importation of their product into the United States because of their concern for their product being employed in executions. Where do we stand on the safety and again, this is areas rich with irony. I'm talking about the safety, efficacy, and humanity of executing someone. Not quite sure how we found an area where those topics overlap, but where does that stand right now? Because we've had years of controversy, and in fact, my reading of the history is that the embargo on the death penalty federally began in part because of the confusion and chaos surrounding protocols.
Yeah, that's right. There's been just a total meltdown around the execution protocols over the past 2 decades in this country. And as you correctly pointed out, it's not because of activists or groups like myself that are tying this up in the courts. In fact, it's actually the drug manufacturers themselves that are putting in stipulations and doing everything they can in their power to prevent their product from being sold and used in this manner, which I would argue, again, as a conservative, that is your right to freedom of association. That is your right as a business person to not have to participate in transactions that you find unethical. And I think that that's something we should stand with the pharmaceutical companies on, because they've done everything they possibly can to be clear about this, and you still have states trying to do a runaround and often go through nefarious means to still solicit these drugs behind their backs. And that's why you see a lot of states passing these anti-transparency laws around the death penalty. And they'll say, oh, we want to protect these companies from the public. We don't want their names out there because they might get attacked by the public. That's not the truth at all. The reality is that they're trying to keep the companies themselves from knowing that they have their drugs. So people should be really wary of that if their state lawmakers or other representatives are pushing those kinds of really bad bills. On top of that, though, we do know that there's been many, many issues brought up in the court by different people who are defendants and their lawyers alleging that these drugs produce torture. To the best of my knowledge, I'm not a scientist, but it does look like there is some merit to that, and courts are still ruling in different ways in different states, and those cases are all at various processes. The federal government did have a stay on a number of executions that began around, I think, 05 or 06, and so that has been the holdup for 16 years at the federal level. They, in order to move forward with these 5 executions, are moving to a new protocol where they'll only be using one drug, which is pentobarbital, which has been very controversial, and we'll see what happens as far as that goes. But in short, yes, there are many problems. We moved to the lethal injection protocol a number of years ago because basically proponents of the death penalty had been trying to outrun the Constitution for a long time. And they keep producing means that don't pass the muster of the Eighth Amendment and could be ruled cruel and unusual. And so then they keep trying to find new means, which is what was supposed to happen with the drugs. But we know that's not really what has transpired. They produce side effects akin to being waterboarded, and we've seen the distress that people have witnessed of those being executed with these drugs. And so I really think there's probably a larger court decision coming down the pipeline at some point. Due to that, you've seen some states like Tennessee actually go back to using an electric chair in the past year, which is just absolutely bonkers. They've carried out 2 or 3, I think, executions with the electric chair in recent years to try to get around this. So it's really a pretty sad state of affairs and really desperate. And, to sum all of this segment up on this point is keep in mind all of this just continues to exacerbate the cost, on top of what the trial costs. Imagine what the states are spending, the federal government spending on these kinds of lawsuits and trying to develop these drugs and elicit these drugs behind the backs of the manufacturers. There's no telling what they're spending.
You mentioned court cases, and if you're just joining me, by the way, Hannah Cox from Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty has joined us, conservativesconcerned.org. What can the ordinary American do right now? If you're a liberty-minded individual, if you're a conservative who sees this as a grotesque intrusion on not only human rights, but on but exacerbating the power of government. If you're like me, a committed libertarian who just finds everything about this reprehensible, what can we do as citizens?
Yeah, I think there's a lot you can do. People forget how much power they have as American citizens. And as a whole, the states know that people are turning against this issue. That's why you've seen 11 states this year alone with Republican-sponsored bills to repeal the death penalty. So I think first and foremost, people need to make sure their lawmakers hear them at both the federal and state level. Let them know, I'm a conservative or I'm a libertarian and I don't support that, and here are the reasons why, and I don't want you to support it, and I want to see something done about this. I think they can donate, obviously, to groups like mine or the Eighth Amendment projects that are, working towards repeal and sponsoring a lot of the activities that are going on around these repeal efforts in different locations. If you don't have money, you can give your time and get involved with different chapters. People can do things like write op-eds and letters to their editor, give speeches at their local, Republican or Libertarian group meetings, help educate people about the problems with the system. Because like I said earlier, if you just get the facts around how it's operating in front of people, you'll find that most people quickly lose their support of it. And then, I think on top of all of that, you can continue to try to just spread the word on social media, share thought pieces, and just try as best you can to get the word out there.
Well, you guys are certainly doing a hell of a job. My hat's off to you. The way that you've reacted under sudden circumstances speaks to the professionalism of your effort. Folks need to support you. It's a wonderful website. It just lays out everything in stunning detail. You folks don't mince words, but at the same time, your approach is factual as opposed to emotional. And as a libertarian, I applaud that. We need, quite frankly, as a wise philosopher once said, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. I thank you so much for joining us. I hope you'll include us on your list of press releases and keep us up to date, and to whatever degree in our own way out here in New England that we can help amplify your efforts, we are here. And so, Hannah Cox, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
All right. And we will have the podcast out to you soon, both on here as well as on YouTube. So
wonderful.
And should you find your way into New England, I think New England is largely free from death penalty issues. But should you find your way up here, please stop up so that both the Libertarian Party of Rhode Island and the Coalition can give you a warm welcome. Thanks so much for your efforts.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
All right, folks, we're going to take a very quick break right now. We're going to go to the Libertarian Hour in our segment. I want to thank Hannah Cox joining us. During the day this week, for the last 2 days since Attorney General Barr made his announcement, she has been fielding media requests from around the nation at the highest level. We're certainly grateful for her for taking the time out from her Friday evening to spend time with us. Folks, we are the Coalition, loud and proud. We're going to take a very quick break, and we're going to bring on the line Josh Smith, Aaron Adams, and a few other libertarians to talk about the hashtag LP Everywhere. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.